Hi everyone, welcome back. This is the 7th video in the series on how to compose, with a particular emphasis on GCSE and A-level music. And for this class we're going to be looking at textures for the string quartet. It's probably one of the most common genres to compose in for GCSE or A-level. Some students do prefer to compose for a melody instrument plus piano, or maybe some sort of traditional arrangement, or maybe like a rock group or something. But especially for A-level, string quartets are very, very popular, and you don't even need to be able to perform violin, viola or cello to write some pretty decent string quartet compositions, as long as you follow some guidelines and some rules. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. Let's jump straight into our new handout. Yeah, so as you can see, the string quartet, the chamber music genre, gained in popularity during the classical era. So all chamber music, everything from trios to piano sonatas, violin sonatas, anything that was for a small group of musicians to be played in the house or in the home, in the parlor, that type of thing. So chamber music was very, very popular in the classical period. A small group of solo musicians intended to be played in a room or in a chamber, rather than a hall with one instrument to a part. The string quartet is probably the most popular one. It's basically, you could think of it like a sonata for four string instruments, and the usual makeup of that would be two violins, viola and cello. It actually evolves from the Baroque trio sonata, which you guys don't actually need to know much about unless you'd be doing maybe grade 8 ABRSM theory, what a trio sonata is, but it's very similar with harpsichord, cello and two violins or maybe two flutes or something. So even though it's called the trio sonata, there was actually four instruments involved, because the harpsichord and the cello would share the same part. Haydn was the crucial figure in establishing the string quartet around the 1750s into the 1760s, so we are going to be probably looking at some of his string quartets along with Mozart and maybe Beethoven as well, just to get an idea of how the musicians relate to each other, what their roles are, their traditional roles, and how the texture of a string quartet is made up. Usually a string quartet's in four movements. The first movement, allegro, fast, and it's usually in sonata form as well. That's probably what we're going to be doing for our string quartets. If you're not sure about sonata form, there is a video that I made on that, so just have a look at the previous video. I think it's actually the 6th video in this series. There are slow movements as well. The second movement is usually the slower movement. Third movement is usually fast minuet and trio form. And the fourth movement is either in rondo form or sonata rondo form. So we're probably going to look at the first movement, because that is the form that we've already looked at, sonata form. String quartets are very different to other instrumental genres of the classical period. Of course, not only do they have just four instruments, they kind of concentrate on the essentials of the music. So there isn't much opportunity for coloristic effects or indulgent harmonic padding. Symphonies, for example, have many instruments that can enrich the texture by providing layers of harmony beyond the essential 3-note triad. Concertos offer the opportunity to fully explore the personal characteristics of individual instruments, so lots of virtuosic passages and maybe exploring the extreme ranges of the instrument, that type of thing. But in string quartets, each musician plays a crucial role to achieve the overall effect, and is simultaneously a soloist and an ensemble performer. So each line should be considered very carefully when you're composing a string quartet. Don't just relegate one instrument to doing the same thing, or maybe just doing something in the background all the time. You have to bring it forward at some stage in your composition, so everyone gets maybe a chance to play the melody, or maybe to play the accompaniment ideas. So every instrument in a string quartet should have its opportunity to shine. So this is why the string quartet is considered a prestigious form, representing one of the true tests of a composer's skill, and also one of the reasons why it's so popular, especially for A-level. But I would even encourage GCSE students to have a go at composing a string quartet. Early string quartets were often performed outside in the streets and courtyards of Vienna, so the harpsichord was omitted in favour of the viola, which provided a sonorous middle range. Yeah, so It'd be nice maybe if you're doing a string quartet not to have the viola too high, because that range, that timbre tends to be occupied by the other two violins. So maybe focusing a bit more on the lower register of the viola, the sort of really rich, darker sounds of the viola that the violin can't actually reach. So here you can see, this is a video off YouTube of students performing probably one of the most famous string quartets, The Lark by Haydn. And if we just press play on the video for a second, and I'll make the video a bit larger. So you should be able to see the relationship between the instruments. Violin and viola together. Cello providing the harmonic framework underneath. Lots of root position notes for each chord. And the first violin providing the main melodic line. And notice everybody gets an opportunity for some melodic ideas. Okay, so that's a good example of sort of how some of the instruments may relate to each other in a string quartet. The second violin and the viola tend to, in this string quartet, tend to follow each other quite closely, maybe in thirds or sixths. The cello provides the sort of quaver movement and maybe a lot of the root position notes for each chord to propel the music forward and provide a stable harmonic foundation for each bar. And the main melody then would be taken up by the first violin. Now that's just how this string quartet opens. At some stage maybe all those roles are shared or swapped around by different instruments. So that's how you would develop your melody and introduce some new ideas and just some interest as well. So not everyone is going to be limited to the same role the whole way through the string quartet. Okay, so some of the textures we're going to look at are based mostly, I think, on Tom Pankhurst's website, where he goes into this in a lot more detail than I do. So definitely worth checking out his website for ideas and composition, and probably a lot of other things to do with GCSE and A-level music as well. So some of the features that he has listed, you're going to see here as well, of string quartets. So some of the textural features that he mentions on his website, you're going to see here in this handout. So the first model, or the first idea for texture here, we're going to look at Mozart's String Quartet number 3 in G major, the first movement, of course. You can see that the melody-dominated homophony is the main texture here. We've got homophonic texture and a main melody over the top of it. Of course, in the first violin, that's the traditional role of where the melody tends to go in a string quartet, at least when the string quartet is first heard, the opening material. This sort of cha-cha accompaniment with the second violin and viola filling in the harmonies. So the cello is doing the lowest notes of each chord, while the inner instruments, the second violin and viola, are providing the rest of the harmony. So this sort of cha-cha, 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 cha-cha. Very sort of good texture to think about if you're going to be writing in, say, triple time. You could rhythmically adapt it to any time signature, though, so it could be something in 4/4 like cha-cha-cha, cha-cha-cha, cha-cha-cha. Or maybe for 2/4 cha, cha, cha. So as long as you have the lowest note, I suppose the bass note, and then the rest of the chord filled out on the other beats of the bar. So that's one idea. So maybe that would be a good idea to start your string quartet, but I wouldn't keep to the same texture the whole way through. You do want, of course, to change the texture every so often. Maybe have the bridge passage doing a different texture, maybe have the second subject doing another texture. So let's look at a few more just to get some ideas. This again from Mozart's string quartets, and this is from number 4 in C major, the first movement. The top two parts are moving in thirds this time, so unlike the previous model where the inner parts were very closely aligned with each other, it's now the two violins that are very closely related, and they're moving in thirds. Simple bass line adds energy with lots of repeated quavers, helping propel the music forward a bit more. Note how the viola fills in the gaps at the end of the second and fourth bars. So here, for example, yeah, just to keep the music moving forward while everyone else is playing a crotchet and then followed by crotchet rests. The viola has this little motif that just keeps the music moving forward, and that happens in the second bar and the fourth bar here as well. Same idea. Yeah, so that could be a very nice texture as well for the sort of maybe a faster passage, maybe the bridge passage or something. Have all those repeated quavers in the cello part. That's quite common. The third model, or 3A I suppose, we're looking at Haydn String Quartet number 5 in D major, the second movement. Again, melody dominated homophony at the opening. Texture is lightened and rhythm given a lift by lack of accompaniment on the first beat. Yes, so we actually have crotchet rests on the first beat of each bar here. So da 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 ba 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 ba. Parallel thirds between the second violin and viola in bars 5 and 7. So bar 5 and bar 7 as well. Kind of acts as a filler between the fragments of the melody in the first violin. Yeah, so the violin has bar rests as well. Don't be afraid to do that, by the way. So often when students are composing in any genre, not just the string quartet, they tend to have everybody playing all the time, all the way through. Don't be afraid to introduce like a couple of rests here and there, or even a full bar rest, especially for the melodic line. It forces the listener to their attention to another part of the texture, which is really nice, and sort of makes the other instruments, lifts their importance a wee bit, you know, that you actually hear what everyone else is doing and you're not distracted by a melodic line all the time. So the violins are in octaves or in unison at the cadences. This is very common in our early Haydn. So we actually have unison here with the two violins both doing D and C sharp at the end of that phrase. So that's a good texture to think about as well. Maybe having some rests on the first beat of each bar. This model is quite similar to the previous one. This is model 3B. Haydn String Quartet number 1 in G major, first movement. Again, simple homophonic texture energized by staccato quavers, except now we do have a crotchet on the first beat of each bar. Note the echo of the main melody in the second violin in bar 4. Yeah, so here you can see that the main melodic line that we've heard before, this sort of dotted rhythm idea, comes back in the second violin. Again, while the first violin is performing nothing, the first violin has rests at that point. Note how the idea and texture is developed from the upbeat to bar 9 for the second half of the phrase. Yeah, so the sort of upbeat idea, we've seen this before quite a few times. That is used quite a bit for the second half of the phrase. Note how the viola can play in thirds where necessary to fill out the texture. Yeah, so the double stopping here going on in the viola just to fill out that harmonic line. You don't have to do that too much if you're not comfortable with double stopping. It's not something you absolutely have to do, especially for GCSE. They wouldn't be expecting you to know, unless you're a violin player, they wouldn't expect you to know where all the good places are for double stopping or even triple stopping. In other words, playing two notes at once on a stringed instrument. But you can, if you're doing that for A-level, have it, especially coming up to cadences maybe, just to fill out that harmony. Or if there's another part that's performing nothing, there's rests in another part, you may want to consider thickening up the texture just a little. Or perhaps you want the texture to sound thinner at that point, in which case do the opposite. Don't have any double stopping. The fourth model, Haydn String Quartet number 5 in F major, second movement. Again, gentle pizzicato accompaniment. That is very common as well, to have pizzicato accompaniment ideas. We have it in the second violin, viola, and down here as well in the cello, performing the root of each chord, I suppose. And that actually gives us quite a slower bass movement as well. You can see that unlike the previous model where you might have had lots of repeated quavers, here we've just got C crotchets separated, of course, by crotchet rests as well. So that gives quite a sparse accompaniment and allows quite a slow bass part. All the focus will be on the melodic line here. Note that all the notes of the chord are covered all of the time. Yeah, so making sure that you do try to have as often as you can a full triad, because you do have 4 parts to play with. You shouldn't have any problems putting in all 3 notes belonging to your chord. And of course, if you wanted a dominant 7th chord, for example, that would be possible as well, coming up to cadences. The 5th model, Haydn String Quartet number 5, the 4th movement, alternation of 2 contrasting ideas. Okay, so this is quite interesting. Homophonic repeated cadential idea. So yeah, at the start you can see that. It's almost like a 5-1, 5-1 in the key of D major. Double pedal with the melody first over the top in the violin and then underneath in the cello. Okay, so yeah, this melodic idea here, up here in the violin, which is then taken up by the cello part, and the double pedal idea in the inner voices here, the whole way through there. So again, that gives the cello a melodic line to perform as well, which is kind of nice because, as you can see in all the previous models we've looked at, the cello was usually just, performing the bass notes of each, or the root of each chord, or maybe repeating quavers or something. So it's nice to give the cello a melodic line. And think about doing that for your viola as well. Maybe not so important doing it between first and second violin, because you're going to have the same sort of sound, the same sort of timbre between those 2 instruments. Whereas when you move a melody into the cello or into the viola, it's very noticeable a change in timbre when that happens, and just provides more contrast and interest to your composition. The 6th model here, Beethoven String Quartet number 7, the 1st movement. Melody appears first in the cello, so that's kind of interesting. Nearly everything we've seen so far, it's the first violin. That tends to be the traditional role of the first violin, is to present the melodies at least at the start, and then of course the melody can move anywhere. But here we have the cello actually performing that melody at the beginning, with quaver accompaniment in the inner parts. The quavers keep a sense of urgency that would otherwise be lacking. Yeah, so having these repeated ideas, seen that quite often actually, these repeated quavers, and in this case with the inner parts providing those repeated quavers. So maybe that's something to pay particular attention to, the idea of the second violin and the viola being very closely aligned with one another. We've seen that in quite a few models so far. Beethoven String Quartet number 4 in C minor, 1st movement. Tension created by the quaver pedal in the cello, with the inner part initially just filling in with long notes. Yeah, so we have quaver pedal in the cello again, with these kind of octave leaps in C. The inner part initially just filling in with longer notes, and then it too then builds up the tension or the climax of the piece, with the inner parts now playing quavers as well. So you can see that the texture here changed quite a bit from the first phrase and then into the second idea. We have the repeated quavers in the inner parts as well. The 8th model, back to Mozart, String Quartet number 17 in B flat, the 4th movement. Begins monophonically, so it's just the first violin. Haven't seen that before with nobody else performing. But in bars 3 and 7, the violin and viola, and in bar 11, the cello are added to reinforce the texture. So here, for example, that's quite a unique texture. I think it's you don't come across that too much actually. The violin is performing the melody on its own with just little snippets of accompaniment or harmony with the inner parts. Yeah, so from bar 17 onwards, the question and answer texture is basically 2-part writing. So you have the viola and the cello performing in octaves, and then you have that's answered, I suppose, by the 2 violins, also in octaves. So it is 2-part writing, I suppose. So that's kind of nice idea as well, to contrast the opening, the sort of monophonic opening, with this call and response, or question and answer, I should say, texture here. Model number 9, Beethoven String Quartet number 1, 1st movement, octave unison texture in first 4 bars. So again, that's quite dramatic, with fuller homophonic texture in the second half of the phrase. Yes, when the melody is back up in the first violin, while the rest of the texture is just performing chords or longer note values. Note how the second half of the extract takes the opening motif as its starting point. Yeah, so you have this opening motif here, and then that is also performed just an octave higher in the second half of the phrase. Yeah, so hopefully that gives you some idea of the textures that are possible for string quartet writing. They're quite varied. There tends to be a couple of things to watch out for. The inner voices often tend to be closely aligned. So the second violin and viola tend to be, in thirds or maybe performing similar ideas to each other. So they tend to back each other up quite a lot. The cello can usually perform sort of fast quaver movement to propel the music forward if you want more energy and drive in your composition, or can perform just very basic notes of the root of the chord, maybe as crotchets separated by rests. And sometimes also you should think about having the melody in the cello part just to provide contrast to the sound. And sometimes the first and second violin can be closely aligned as well. Very common in Haydn's earlier quartets for those two instruments to perform in unison or octaves coming up to a cadence. And also maybe think about the idea of rests within the bars, or maybe a full bar rest, and providing the opportunity to maybe have call and response between, say, the lower instruments and the higher instruments, or maybe the extremes and the inner voices. So there's lots of possibilities there for each section of your set work. And I would say a lot of this could also be done in the development section if you're doing sonata form. But so think about maybe having one texture for one particular section, like your first subject, and another texture for your bridge, another texture for your second subject, and maybe for the recapitulation where all the same musical material comes back, maybe think about just changing the texture, accompaniment. Even if the melody is going to be the same and it's going to be in the tonic key, might be a good idea to have different accompaniment patterns and different textures in your recapitulation. Okay, so just an extra couple of slides here just on motif and texture analysis. So this is from Mozart's String Quartet number 15, the third movement, Minuet and Trio. The opening motif here, that I've just labeled it as A. You can actually see that it's spread throughout the entire texture, and it happens quite a lot. This dotted quaver, semiquaver, followed by a crotchet or a longer note over the bar. So this dotted rhythm on the repeated note is arranged in descending sequence, but melodically it's quite flat. It appears everywhere in the texture, so it's not, a soaring melody or, wide range or anything. It's just this little repeated note idea. The second motif, this repeated crotchet motif, generated from the tail of the opening motif to become a prominent feature in the middle of the melody. Yeah, so these repeated crotchet ideas up in the first violin. And together those two motifs provide the sort of main theme. So you can see that repeated ideas is going to be quite important. Think of your theme or your melody well in advance before starting to write out all the accompaniment patterns, because what you don't want to do is just start in bar one and write all four parts and then go into the second bar, into the third bar, and then having no sort of relationship between the parts or between one bar and the next. Here you can see Mozart is provided a lot of unity, a lot of cohesion to this opening idea by having the same two motifs appear quite a lot throughout the entire texture. What about a harmonic analysis? What sort of chords could we think about? We already sort of covered this in a previous video. If you get stuck up where the chords like to progress to, the circle of fifths progression is always good to keep in mind. But this is from the same string quartet, number 15 by Mozart, third movement. You can see that most of it does tend to be tonic and dominant harmony. So you have this, even chord 7 is part of your dominant function group, I suppose. There's some secondary function chords, your 5 of chord 4, and then your chord 4. We've also got some chromatic harmony here, an augmented 6th chord. This is highly charged in this part of the music. And then towards the end, we've got very sort of traditional chord progressions here. Lots of tonic and dominant harmony, and a nice sort of cadential 6/4 there as well. A couple of dominant 7th chords. One of them's even in third inversion, so that's really, really nice. And then we're ending, on the D minor perfect cadence there. So common features then, just to sum up some of the common features. The 4-part texture frequently falls into 2 parts. Violins 1 and 2 together, an octave apart, notated in the treble clefs. The viola tends to be in the alto clef and the cello's in the bass clef together, also an octave apart. Movement in thirds or maybe tenths if you're thinking of compound intervals, and sixths as well, so the inversion of a third, I suppose. All of those are quite common. Unison passages can be common at the beginning or at cadences, probably not in the sort of middle of the phrase in the pre-cadential material. You don't want too much unison there. In contrast to Baroque trio sonatas, the most prominent part was given to the first violin, with other instruments providing an accompaniment role. But do, of course, change that over the course of the music. You don't want the first violin just to do all the heavy lifting the whole way through the composition. The accompaniment is usually a combination of arpeggios, broken chord figurations, repeated notes, rests, pizzicato, held chords, sustained chords, that type of thing. So you have a whole range of accompaniment ideas to think about there. Later quartets often had contrapuntal passages. We'll probably try doing that in our composition in the development section, involving imitation and fugal writing, showing the gradual liberation of the second violin, viola and cello into equal independent partners with the leader. Yeah, so that's probably what we're going to aim for, like a later sort of classical string quartet, you know, like a sort of as if something was composed in, say, the 1800s or something, early 1800s. Of course, also have at hand the ranges of each instrument, and you definitely don't want to go too low. So it must be observed, of course, that you don't go any lower than this C for the cello, or this C for the viola, or indeed this G below middle C for the violins. So early string quartets do use a limited range of notes anyway. I would say at the most you'd probably need just to go up to high D in the violin. You don't really need to go into the stratosphere, you know, into very, very high notes. You can, but it's not, as you saw from all the early examples there, it doesn't happen that often that you go above high D. Composers like Mozart and Haydn introduced wider ranges for all the instruments. Yeah, I do tend to go as well quite low, especially for the viola and cello. I do try to get the sort of lower range of those instruments, because I'm often aware that if everything sounds high, it can be very trebly. You've already got quite a lot of the treble sound already with two violins, so maybe having the viola and cello do a lot of the lower ranges, it would be nice. Okay, well, hopefully that gives you some ideas of what you can do for your textures for your string quartets. In our next couple of videos, we're going to be just jumping straight into the actual composing side, I suppose. So these first 7 videos were all just to give you the background knowledge, I suppose, of how to actually go about writing melodies, how to think about chords, how to think about modulations, how to think about writing for a string quartet. And now we're actually going to spend the next few videos just doing that and filling out our composition. So if you have any questions or any comments or anything you want to ask, just leave it below the video in the comment section. I'll get back to them as soon as I can, and I'll see you again in the next video.